As we start our genetics unit, it's important to have a little bit of background knowledge about what genetics is, and then make sure we didn't forget everything from before mid-year exams about DNA and protein synthesis. And this video also looks at Mendel, who we consider the father of genetics. So when we talk about genetics, it's the science of heredity. Okay? So you inherit traits or genes from your parents and grandparents and so on, going back all the generations. So it's looking at how those traits or that genetic information gets passed from one generation to the next. And we know from our studies of meiosis that the sex cells are formed and then those are used in fertilization to create a zygote. So we know how the DNA is physically passed on, and this looks at, when we study genetics, we're really looking at how those traits can influence other characteristics. To recap what we looked at with DNA and protein synthesis, remember that when we talk about heredity, we're looking at genes, and genes really come down to the sequence of the nucleotide base, the nucleotides and the nitrogen bases on those nucleotides. So the A, the T, the C, the G, and those determine the mRNA in transcription, and then that during translation, that determines the amino acid sequence and what proteins are made. And then proteins are responsible for pretty much everything that happens in our bodies: structures, functions, enzymes, signaling, communication, transport. So proteins are super important. So remember, transcription takes place in the nucleus, so you get the mRNA, and then that mRNA is used in translation to make the protein, and the proteins perform all the functions that we just talked about. As mentioned earlier, Gregor Mendel is considered the father of genetics, and he was a monk and a scientist who lived in the 1860s. Well, he did his work in the 1860s in what is now Austria, and he studied the traits of garden peas. So just kind of your standard, you might have some at home in the spring and summer, you might have pea plants in your garden. That's what he was studying. What's really important to remember when we're talking about Mendel's work in genetics is that at this time, there was nothing known about DNA. Studies involving DNA did not begin until the early part of the 20th century, and it wasn't until the 1950s that we understood the structure of DNA. So what Mendel did is pretty amazing considering the lack of scientific knowledge that didn't even exist at that time. Here are the 7 traits that Mendel studied with pea plants. He looked at seed shape and color and looked at flower color and position. He looked at the pods, the pea pods themselves, their color and their shape, and also how tall the plants were. So a lot of times when we're talking about different genetic examples, we might look at some of these 7 traits. What made Mendel's experiments so important to our understanding of genetics is that he really did a great job of following the scientific method. So one thing he did is he studied one trait at a time. He isolated the variable. So think about when we set up an experiment, we always are trying to isolate that one independent variable to see what effect that has. Another thing he did is he used really large sample sizes. So he was looking at thousands of plants. He also repeated the experiments, and so he kept showing that these same things could be observed again and again and again. And finally, he applied mathematics, specifically probability, which we'll be talking about in class, to the results. And that can be used to make predictions, which is how oftentimes we think about genetics, looking at that probability.